Hi.
Hello again. We're in the Pure Worship book.
On page 23, paragraph 26, under the subheading Worship at the Temple.
And I'm reading from the screen once more, and Vivian from the book.
Centuries after Israel settled in the Promised Land, King Solomon built a center for pure worship that was far grander than the tabernacle. At first, Jehovah was the only recipient of the sacrifices offered at this temple. Solomon and his subjects offered vast quantities of sacrifices of high quality in the manner outlined in God's law. And they reference 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 63. However, the cost of the building and the number of sacrifices were not what made worship at the temple acceptable to Jehovah. What mattered was the motive of those offering the gifts. Solomon emphasized that point at the dedication of the temple. He said, "Let your heart be complete with Jehovah our God by walking in his regulations and by keeping his commandments as on this day."
Unfortunately, the Israelites did not continue to follow the king's wise counsel. They failed to fulfill one or more of the key aspects of pure worship. The kings of Israel and their subjects allowed their hearts to be corrupted. They lost faith in Jehovah, and they abandoned his righteous standards. Time and again, Jehovah lovingly sent prophets to correct them and to warn them of the consequences of their actions. Noteworthy among those prophets was the faithful man Ezekiel. He lived at a critical time in the history of pure worship.
Mm-hmm.
I find it so telling that they've basically jumped over 4 centuries here from Solomon to Ezekiel.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think...
2 paragraphs.
2 paragraphs, and you would think from these 2 paragraphs that pure worship is about the ritual of the temple. And that's scarily similar, of course, to what the attitude of the establishment was at the time.
Yeah.
So doing the right thing at the temple, that is what you consider sacred service, according to your definitions, as the Watchtower defines them, field service, going to meetings regularly, and other theocratic things.
Yeah.
Well, the prophets who you said God lovingly sent are telling you that's not enough. That's why it's so hazardous to just skip right over what was the burden of the prophets.
So when they give you scripture reference, they say 1 Kings 8, 57 to 61, but they only quote one verse, right? That's the latter part, is the only thing they quote, verse 61.
Yeah, well, I think we should read the whole thing, including verse 56, where Solomon starts, but also note what's the burden of those prophets, though. The burden of them is social justice, that you have the responsibility to love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
And why are they persecuted? Because they keep telling the establishment, God's organization,
it's not enough what you're doing.
And then you think of the history, we've just gone over early Old Testament history here for about 20 pages. When you think of all of that history, you realize the theocracy is really only born in the time of Moses, in the sense that you understand this idea of God's theocratic organization, the priesthood, and even the line of the prophets are only born then. But they're already God's people.
Yeah.
And they're God's people after that theocracy collapses or is judged by God in around 600 BC. After the theocracy is gone, they're still God's people.
Yeah.
That's missing here. It's this squeezing together of the 2 concepts of God's true religion and God's people into one concept.
Yeah, so that it's just about ritual, worship at the temple, ritual. And I think if you look at the Old Testament, the other thing that you seem to miss as a witness is that having different positions provided checks and balances. So nobody had ultimate authority. In the Watchtower, the structure is ultimate authority, but we're everything. We're all those parts.
Yes.
Whereas in the Old Testament, there was a king, which they decided not God really, but he allowed them to have a king. They had priesthood, they had prophets, they had the elders or the leaders of the homes and the tribes.
And the local elders, the wise men
Yeah.
of the local tribes, right?
So that provided some checks and balances, particularly the prophets, because they were usually the ones that came in and criticized.
They were outside the establishment,
Yeah.
most of the time.
Yeah. So in the Watchtower, who's that?
All those offices, those
They're-
four, if you want to
yeah.
view them together,
Are
they are
all
all
them.
they are all four.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no checks and balances. There's no way you can correct a problem.
So the concept of God's organization, God has always had an organization. No, he only had that theocratic arrangement for about 1,000 years at the most.
Mm-hmm.
Parts, for the rest of Israel's history, parts were missing.
Right.
Especially the theocratic part that you think is most essential, the guys at the top.
Mm-hmm.
They were missing after the exile.
Yeah.
They had no king anymore, no aristocracy. They forged another one.
But they're still called God's people
Yeah.
while they're in exile. They're
That's-
still God's people.
That's the big difference. So this text in 1 Kings is helpful in a way, but the very fact that they've skipped over verse 56, missed it completely.
Yeah.
So let's read the whole thing. So this is what Solomon says after his prayer, right? When he's
Yeah.
getting up from his kneeling position where he was giving the main part of the prayer. And then he says
Dedication.
this is the dedication or benediction at the
Yeah.
end of the prayer.
So it's verses 56 to 61 of chapter 8, 1 Kings. Blessed be the Lord that has given rest to his people Israel, according to all that he promised. There has not failed one word of all his good promise, which he promised by the hand of Moses his servant. The Lord our God be with us, as he was with our fathers. Let him not leave us, nor forsake us, that he may incline our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and his statutes, and his judgments, which he commanded our fathers. And let these my words, wherewith I have made supplication before the Lord, be nigh to the Lord our God, day and night, that he maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel at all times, as the matter shall require, that all the people of the earth may know that the Lord is God, and that there is none else. Let your heart, therefore, be perfect with the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments, as at this day.
And then all the sacrifices follow that prayer. Why would they skip over verse 56? Well, my suggestion is that they're uncomfortable with the concept that if God is really doing this theocracy, if this is really his organization, what will happen? Not a word of the prophets will fail.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not going to be comfortable with that part of Israel's history.
Because
And that's true.
they connect God's promises with the people's faithfulness.
Yeah.
Whereas God's promises are faithful. We don't have to worry about what he promises.
So although Israel was unfaithful, everything the Israel prophets said was true.
Yeah.
So there's this breaking off of the idea of truth, that is true religion, practice, pure worship, from the idea that God is speaking through this people.
Yeah.
He is still using the prophets despite the unfaithfulness of the people. And then this idea that Solomon prays that God may incline our hearts to him. Where's that in your Watchtower theology?
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's all up to you, really, in the Watchtower. It's up to you.
It's on you to be faithful.
Yeah.
So, of course, the prophets, who you said God lovingly sent, also, in addition to bringing the bad news, which got them persecution from the establishment, also brought the good news, namely that God was not going to forsake his people.
Yeah.
You have him even praying for that in verse 57. May he not leave us or forsake us. And you say he did forsake them after the year 70.
And he left them. Yeah.
So this idea that God will incline their hearts, well, has Solomon's prayer been answered or not? Because the prophets are unanimous that one day all Israel will be saved. That doesn't mean each and every Israelite will be saved, but it does mean the totality of Israel. God will be faithful to his promises, that one day they will be his people, and that somehow it will connect with the Gentiles.
He doesn't cast off the faithful because some are unfaithful.
Verse 60. And why is this? Solomon says that God should be faithful to his people Israel and should incline their hearts towards him, that all the peoples of the earth, that is the Gentiles, may know that Yahweh is God and there is no other.
Yeah.
So he connects God's faithfulness to his covenant people, theocracy or not, because the theocracy was gone most of the time. Even during their Old Testament history, there was no theocracy as you understand it.
God vindicates himself by his relationship with his people. People see his relationship with them. They see his promises and his faithfulness to those promises.
Yep.
And that vindicates God. And we're going to see more of that in Ezekiel.
Yeah. And it's all, one day, Solomon's prayer is going to be answered. It's not just Solomon's prayer, it's the prophet's prayer, and it was David's prayer.
Yeah.
And it was Moses' song, if you read Deuteronomy 33 and 34.
Now, the witnesses say that they are modeled after Israel as an organization. Their understanding is that Israel is an organization. So they say that God sent lovingly prophets who are the critics. What do they do with anyone who's a critic?
Who dares to speak up within the
The
organization.
framework? They do exactly what Israel did. Shut them up. In the case of Israel, they would even kill them.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah. But in the case of God's organization now, if you consider Jehovah's Witnesses God's organization, anyone who dares to criticize anything about the organization is cut off and prevented from living among their brothers. They're just cut off. They're silenced. They might as well be dead. They're not allowed to hear them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's our link this time?
We have a link to a video we did from the Proclaimer's book, and it's called Absolute Power Corrupts Absolutely.
Yeah. See you soon.